At 10:17 on a Friday morning, Thomas Bennett placed his daughter's bags on the front porch and told her she could come back when she had something better than excuses. By 4:11 that same afternoon, a black SUV with federal plates would stop in front of the same house. The whole street would go silent, and the man stepping out of that vehicle would introduce himself as the father of her unborn child. If Thomas Bennett had known that at 10:17, he would have made a different choice. But that was the tragedy of the day. He didn't know. And worse than that, he didn't ask. Lila Bennett was 23 years old, 7 months pregnant, and standing on the front steps of the only home she had ever known with 2 duffel bags at her feet and one hand pressed flat against the place where her son had started kicking harder whenever she was under stress. The summer air was already hot enough to feel personal. Her mother stood inside the doorway, with one arm folded across her waist and the other wrapped around the knob, as if keeping the door half open somehow made what was happening less final. Her father remained in the hallway behind her, not looking angry now, which would have been easier somehow, but fixed in that hard, terrible calm people wear when they have convinced themselves their cruelty is actually discipline. Her brother Ryan was there too. He was standing near the staircase with both hands shoved into his pockets and his gaze lowered to the hardwood floor. He looked like a man enduring something unpleasant, rather than participating in it. Lila would remember that part later. The way people love to hide inside the difference. No one was shouting. No one had shouted all morning. That almost made it worse. Families often imagine that if they are quiet enough while doing something unforgivable, the act itself becomes less violent. They trade in lowered voices and careful phrasing and the soft closing of doors. They say things like, "This is for the best," and "You've left us no choice," and "Maybe some time apart will make things clear." They drape their rejection in civility and call it concern. But the body understands what the language is trying to hide. Lila understood. She had grown up in that house. She knew exactly where the hall runner lifted at the corners. She knew the kitchen cabinet that stuck in humid weather and the loose tile near the downstairs bathroom, and the way the morning light always fell across the dining room table in strips because one blind had been bent since she was 14. She knew the sound of her father's key in the lock, and her mother's footsteps on the stairs, and her brother's laugh from years ago, before he became careful about laughing too loudly in front of their father. She knew the smell of baked apples in October and furniture polish on Saturdays, and how safety is built out of repetition so ordinary you don't notice it until it is withdrawn. That morning it had been withdrawn. Not because her parents had stopped loving her. That would have been too clean, too simple. They still loved her. That was what made it unbearable. They loved her and still chose this. Loved her and still decided that their embarrassment was heavier than her fear. Loved her and looked at her pregnant body and saw, before anything else, the judgment of other people. Lila had tried to explain. Not wildly, not dramatically. She had not cried at first. She had not begged. She had stood in the kitchen 3 hours earlier with both hands folded in front of her and told them she needed a little time. One day, maybe 2. She told them the father of the baby knew. She told them he was not running. She told them he was already trying to arrange things properly. She told them this was not some casual disaster she expected them to absorb without context. She told them there was context, important context, and that if they would just give her a small amount of time, she could explain everything in full. Her father had asked whether she was married. She said no. Her mother had asked whether the man intended to marry her. She had said yes, but not in the way you mean it. Not as a rescue plan. Not because he's panicking, but because there are things already moving, and I just need a little time before I say more. Her father had said, honorable situations do not require this much explanation. Her mother had said, honorable men do not wait in the shadows while women stand in kitchens defending them. Ryan had stayed silent. That silence had moved around the room like a fourth parent, helpful to everyone except her. The conversation had lasted 19 minutes. Lila knew that because she had glanced at the stove clock twice. Once when she realized she was no longer being heard, and once when she realized they had all agreed before she walked into the room. There had been no real conversation after that. Only the formal delivery of a decision already reached elsewhere. Now here she was. 10:17. 2 bags. Porch. Heat. No home. Her mother finally spoke first. "Call someone," Elaine Bennett said, still not meeting her daughter's eyes for very long. "A friend. You don't have to stand there." Lila almost laughed at that. Not because it was funny, because when pain becomes too large, the body sometimes reaches for any door still standing. She did not have a friend nearby with room to absorb a 7 months pregnant woman and 2 bags with no warning. One was out of town. One lived in a studio apartment over a garage with a staircase so steep it felt aggressive. Another had 3 children under the age of 5 and a husband currently recovering from surgery. There were people who loved her. There was just no one she could call at 10:17 and say, "I've been removed from my own life. Can you hold what remains of it for a while?" "I'll figure it out," she said. Her father nodded once, as if she had finally said something sensible. That, more than anything, almost broke her. Because he sounded relieved. As if the hardest part of the morning had been logistical inconvenience. As if her calmness was making the process more efficient. As if the daughter he had raised to be composed under pressure was now helping him dispose of her with dignity. She bent, lifted the smaller bag first, then the larger one, and her son moved sharply inside her, a hard, rolling protest beneath her ribs. She winced. Ryan looked up then, just for a second. Guilt flashed across his face so quickly she might have missed it if she did not know him as well as she did. "Lila." It was the first thing he had said all morning, but he had nothing after her name. He stopped there, stranded halfway between conscience and habit, and she looked at him long enough for him to understand that whatever words had existed for this moment had already expired. She stepped off the porch. The screen door clicked shut behind her. And just like that, the house where she had spent 23 years became a place she was standing outside of. By sunset, nobody on Maple Grove would be able to stop talking about it. But at 10:18, the street was still ordinary. A dog barked 2 houses down. Someone started a leaf blower despite the heat. A teenager coasted by on a bike with one earbud in, not paying attention. The world had not rearranged itself to honor what had just happened to her. That, Lila would later think, was one of the first adult lessons no one tells you in time. Most heartbreaks occur in broad daylight, while nearby people continue discussing lawn care and grocery lists and weather. She walked to the end of the block before stopping to call Evan. Straight to voicemail. She closed her eyes, listened to the beep, and said, "It's me. I'm okay. I'm not really okay, but I'm safe. They found out. I had to leave. Please call me as soon as you get this." Then she lowered the phone and stared at the dark screen as if she could force it to light back up with him on the other side. Nothing. The battery flashed red and died in her hand. Lila looked up at the bright white sky, at the washed-out summer heat pressing down on the street, and for one frightening moment, she felt the exact size of her aloneness. Not just practically, spiritually. The kind of aloneness that comes when the people who know your childhood have chosen not to stand inside your future. She took a breath, then another. Then she did what people do when their choices are bad and still must be made. She picked the least impossible one. The public library was 3 blocks away. Cool, quiet, free, and indifferent in the most merciful way. No one there would ask why she was carrying bags. No one there would demand an explanation before allowing her to sit down. She could charge her phone. She could think. She could rest long enough for her breathing to stop feeling like it belonged to someone else. So she walked. Every step felt heavier than the one before it. Not only because she was pregnant, because humiliation has weight. People rarely mention that part. Shame is not abstract when you are carrying it through heat with your whole life inside 2 bags. It drags on the shoulders. It shortens breath. It turns the body into evidence. What her parents did not know, what they had not given themselves enough curiosity to discover before deciding their daughter had become unmanageable, was that Evan Carlisle had spent that same morning inside the west wing of a government building, sitting across from his father and telling him the truth. Evan Carlisle was 29 years old, a constitutional law attorney, reserved by temperament, and the only son of President Adrian Carlisle. This was not information Lila had planned to drop into her parents' kitchen like a grenade. Not because she was ashamed, because the truth mattered too much to be used defensively. She had wanted to tell it properly, in sequence, in context, as part of a conversation about love and responsibility and the child she was carrying. She had wanted her parents to hear it as a fact inside a larger emotional truth, not as a shocking twist that could overpower everything else. But their panic had moved faster than her timeline. And so they had thrown out a pregnant woman they imagined was abandoned. She wasn't abandoned. Not even close. Evan had met Lila 9 months earlier at a literacy fundraiser in the City Museum Annex. She had been managing registration at a folding table, with the kind of calm efficiency that made every volunteer around her seem slightly less competent by comparison. He had shown up in dark jeans and a plain blue shirt and started helping stack chairs without being asked. She noticed him first because most well-dressed men who came from powerful families had perfected the art of appearing useful while never lifting anything substantial. Evan was actually working. Carrying boxes, adjusting signs, untangling extension cords. He did it with the easy lack of self-consciousness of someone who had been taught early that effort was not a performance. He noticed her when she corrected a donor's spelling without embarrassing him. Later, he would tell her that was the moment. Not because it was glamorous, because it was kind, precise, and efficient all at once. He came over to her table with a roll of wristbands in one hand and pointed out that the alphabetized list had been arranged by first name instead of last. "It's either a disaster," he said, "or a very committed act of rebellion." She looked up, took in the dry expression, the almost apologetic humor, and said, "It's synced to a donor database that hates surnames." He nodded as if this were a completely reasonable burden. "Then I support your rebellion." She laughed. They talked for 42 minutes. Not flirtation exactly. Not at first. Something better. The low-friction conversation of two minds discovering they can move at the same speed without either one needing to slow down or perform. He called her 2 days later. She asked how he got her number. He answered immediately. No dodge, no grin meant to make the question seem unimportant. He said he had access to resources most people did not, that he had used one, and that if she found that intrusive, he would accept that and leave her alone. She appreciated the honesty. That mattered to her more than polish ever had. So she said yes to dinner. By the 7th date, he told her who he was. Not at an exclusive restaurant, not in a place designed to make the truth feel cinematic. He told her in a small coffee shop with scratched wooden tables and a barista who called everyone honey. He sat across from her, hands wrapped around a cup he had stopped drinking from 10 minutes earlier, and said there was something she needed to hear from him before she heard it from anyone else. Then he told her. She stared at him for a moment. Then she said, "So that explains why every time we try to walk somewhere, there's always one man in sunglasses pretending to care deeply about architecture." He laughed so suddenly he almost knocked his coffee over. That was the first time she heard him laugh without guarding it. It changed something between them. Not because of his name, because she remained exactly herself after hearing it. Not dazzled, not intimidated, not strategic. She did not suddenly become more agreeable or more distant. She just absorbed the information, set it where it belonged, and kept relating to him as Evan. He would later tell her that this was rarer than she could possibly understand. Their relationship was careful, but it was never fake. He lived in a level of visibility that turned ordinary things into stories if the wrong person noticed them. He explained that early. She understood. Not happily, not romantically, but practically. They learned each other in hidden seams of time, late dinners, mornings before meetings, walks in places where people had more important things to do than stare. They built trust the slow way. Repetition, reliability, consistency. Small truths accumulating until they became a life. He was not perfect. That mattered too. Perfection is easy to perform for 6 dates. It is much harder to remain honest in inconvenience. Evan was thoughtful but over-controlled. Gentle but sometimes frustratingly quiet while he thought things through. Protective in ways that occasionally irritated her because she did not enjoy being managed, even by kindness. But he listened when she said so. He adjusted. He apologized cleanly, without dragging self-defense behind the apology like a suitcase. She fell in love with him gradually, which was the only way she ever could have. And when she found out she was pregnant, she told him that same night. No dramatic reveal. No restaurant. No testing of his character through delay. She called and asked if he could come over, and when he arrived, she held out the test with both hands because they were trembling too much to use one. He looked at it, then at her, then sat down very slowly, not because he was recoiling, but because the future had just arrived all at once, and his body needed a chair. He listened while she spoke. About timing. About fear. About the fact that she did not even know yet what she wanted to say after the truth. About how she was not asking for an answer on the spot, only honesty. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. She had learned by then that his silences came in different kinds. This was not withdrawal. This was construction. At last, he said, "I need one night." Not to decide whether he was staying, to decide how to do this right. He called at 7:08 the next morning. He said he was in. Completely. No conditions. No hedging. He said the child was theirs, and so was everything that followed. He said there were complications because of his family and the office his father held, and that if anything became public before certain conversations happened, her life would be ripped open by people who had not earned access to it. He said he needed a little time to speak to his father first, and create the structure that would protect her as much as possible before the world started asking questions it had no right to ask. Lila said she trusted him. She meant it. What neither of them accounted for was a cousin with no boundaries, a family barbecue, and a pregnancy test wrapper seen in a bathroom trash can by exactly the kind of relative who thinks gossip counts as concern if delivered fast enough. By that Friday morning, Lila's father had already heard enough to turn suspicion into certainty. By that Friday morning, his fear of public embarrassment was stronger than his love. By that Friday morning, he had decided that the worst thing his daughter had done was not get pregnant, but get pregnant in a way he could not immediately explain to other people. That was why she ended up in the library. She was sitting in the back reading room with both bags tucked under the table and her phone plugged into a wall outlet near the local history shelves when she finally let herself cry. Not loudly, just enough. Tears came the way water sometimes forces itself through a crack in a wall long before the wall actually gives way. Quiet and persistent, and humiliating, mostly because they arrived after she had worked so hard to stay composed. She pressed the heel of one hand to her eyes and kept the other on her stomach because her son had started moving again, restless in response to the chemicals of her fear. "I know," she whispered, not even aware she had spoken aloud. "I know." At 2:43, a woman in a navy suit approached her table and said, very gently, "Lila Bennett?" Lila looked up immediately. The woman was in her early 40s, composed, warm-faced, with the particular alert stillness of someone who had spent years in situations where calm was part of the job description. There was an earpiece tucked discreetly behind one ear, and the kind of posture that made authority feel less like force and more like readiness. "I'm Nora Hayes," she said. "Evan asked me to find you. He's been trying to reach you." Lila blinked at her. Out of all the surreal sentences available in the world, that one somehow felt both least and most believable. "My phone died." Nora glanced at the charging cable. "I suspected something like that." Lila looked at the suit, the earpiece, the impossible intersection between her private collapse and the machinery surrounding the man she loved, and said the first practical thing that appeared in her mind. "It's only at 11%. Nora nodded like this was a valid tactical obstacle. "We can work with 11%. They sat together for 8 more minutes while the phone charged. Nora did not interrogate her, did not make sympathetic sounds designed to provoke disclosure, did not treat her distress like a report to be filed. She simply sat there, available but not invasive. And in that specific professional gentleness, Lila felt something she had not felt since the screen door closed behind her that morning. Held. Not by family, not by certainty, but held enough. When Evan's call came through, she answered before the first vibration finished. "Hey." That was all she said. The single syllable carried enough damage that he went silent on the other end. Then he asked, very carefully, "Are you hurt?" "No." "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Where are you?" "At the library." Another silence. Smaller this time. Controlled. Then, "Nora's with you?" "Yes." "Good." He told her what had happened that morning, how his father had called him in, how he had answered every question directly, how President Carlyle had asked only 3 things: whether he loved her, whether the baby was his, and whether she was a good woman. How Evan had said yes, absolutely, and she is the best person I know. How his father had sat with that for a moment, and then said he wanted to meet her as soon as she was ready. Lila closed her eyes while he spoke. Not because she was tired, because relief can feel like grief when it arrives too late to prevent the first wound. Then she told him about the kitchen, the porch, the bags, the voicemail, the closed door. He listened without interrupting. When she reached the part about Ryan saying her name and then nothing else, Evan inhaled once, very sharply, and was quiet for so long she thought the call had dropped. Then he said, in a voice so calm it was almost cold, "I'm coming to your parents' house." She sat up straighter. "You do not have to do that." "Yes," he said, "I do." "They've already made up their minds." "That doesn't mean they get the last word." She pressed her fingers to her forehead. "Evan, I don't need a scene." "This isn't a scene," he said. "This is me making sure the people who sent you away understand exactly what they did." She did not answer. Part of her wanted to stop him. Part of her understood, with that deep instinct people sometimes get when the future moves before they can approve it, that something needed to happen. Not for revenge, for definition. Her family had cast her as disposable. Someone needed to challenge that lie in full daylight. He said he would be there in under 90 minutes. At 4:11, the black SUV turned onto Maple Grove. The street changed before anyone consciously recognized why. That was how unusual arrivals worked in places built on sameness. Curtains shifted. A pressure washer went silent halfway through a driveway. Mrs. Delaney from across the street stepped onto her porch with a dish towel still in one hand. 2 teenage boys paused their basketball game in a driveway down the block. A man watering petunias near the corner turned his hose off without looking away. By the time the vehicle stopped in front of the Bennett house, half the block had developed urgent, invisible errands outdoors. Thomas Bennett saw the SUV through the front window and felt, in the space of 2 seconds, confusion harden into dread. He was still in his work clothes. He had been sitting at the kitchen table with untouched coffee, replaying the morning in the private language of men who know something has gone badly wrong, but are not yet ready to call it that. His wife had been moving restlessly from room to room, folding towels that did not need folding, wiping counters already clean. Ryan had come back after lunch and stayed because leaving had felt too much like desertion, though staying had not made him useful. Now the SUV was outside. Then the front passenger door opened. Then the suited figures emerged. Then a man stepped out from the back seat alone. Young, tall, controlled. Charcoal suit. No tie. The kind of face Thomas half recognized, not because he had seen it in person, but because he had passed it on screens for years without expecting it would ever become relevant to his life. The knock on the front door was not loud. It did not need to be. Thomas opened it. The young man standing there looked directly at him and said, "Good afternoon. My name is Evan Carlyle. I'm the father of Lila's child, and I'm here to speak with you about your daughter." Sometimes a name does not land as information. Sometimes it lands as impact. Thomas stared at him, then past him at the SUV. then at the agents positioned with quiet precision near the curb, then at the neighbors no longer pretending not to watch. Then, slowly, horribly, his mind made the connection he had denied himself the curiosity to seek that morning. "Carlyle?" he repeated. Evan nodded once. Thomas's face changed. It was not just shock. Shock is simple. This was larger and uglier and more human than that. It was the expression of a man watching his certainty collapse in public, while another, deeper truth rose up behind it. That even if the young man on his porch had been nobody at all, what he had done to his daughter that morning would still have been wrong. Elaine appeared behind him. She saw the SUV, the agents, the neighbors, then Evan, and her hand flew to her mouth so quickly it looked like a reflex learned in childhood. Ryan came into the hallway last. He took one look at Lila standing by the curb, at the bags, at the impossible tableau now assembled around the house he had grown up in, and the color left his face. Evan did not posture. That was what made the moment so devastating. If he had shouted, Thomas might have hidden behind a fence. If he had sneered, Elaine might have retreated into resentment. If he had weaponized his last name, Ryan might have dismissed the entire scene as power theater. But Evan did none of that. He simply spoke. He said the delay in coming to them properly was his responsibility, not Lila's. He said he and Lila had already discussed the child and their future. He said his father knew, had asked to meet Lila, and intended to welcome her. He said Lila would not be returning to any environment where she had been made to feel ashamed for carrying their son. He said she would come with him now, that she would be cared for, and that if the Bennett family wished to speak again in the future, it would happen with respect or not at all. Then he looked at Lila. That mattered. He had not come to possess her pain, not even to rescue her from it. He had come to stand beside her, to define himself publicly, and to make clear that her future was not being negotiated over her head. She was still the center of the decision. Lila met his eyes. Then she looked at her father in the doorway, her mother behind him, her brother 2 steps back and too late. She had spent the first half of the day feeling small. Now, strangely, she did not. Not because she felt triumphant. Triumph was not the right emotion. The wound was too fresh. But something inside her had straightened, a private axis. The recognition that she had survived the most humiliating morning of her life and was still standing in it, still making choices, still not broken. "I'm ready," she said. One of the agents, not Nora, moved to the bags, but Nora was already there, lifting them before anyone else could. It was such a small thing, so practical. Yet later, Lila would remember it with unreasonable clarity. The quiet dignity of not having to pick up the bags herself a second time. She got into the SUV. Evan slid in beside her. The door closed softly, and as the vehicle pulled away from Maple Grove, no one on that street moved for several long seconds. Because neighborhoods understand spectacle. They know how to metabolize scandal. But what they had just witnessed was something more destabilizing than gossip. They had seen a family's moral certainty collapse in real time. They had watched a daughter they had likely already judged be revealed as loved, claimed, protected, and right to expect more. Thomas stayed on the porch long after the SUV turned the corner. Elaine touched his arm once, and he did not react. Ryan went inside and closed himself in the downstairs bathroom, where he leaned both hands against the sink and tried not to think the sentence he could not stop hearing in his head. You said nothing. That night, Lila was taken not to the White House, not to some gleaming public symbol of power, but to a private residence maintained for extended family and sensitive guests. It had been prepared quickly, thoughtfully, without spectacle. There were flowers in the bedroom, but not too many. Water on the nightstand. Soft lamps instead of harsh overhead lighting. A robe laid across the end of the bed in her size. Unscented lotion in the bathroom. Someone had stocked the refrigerator with yogurt, fruit, crackers, and ginger tea because nausea did not care about political status. Someone had put fresh sheets on the bed and opened the curtains to a garden. It was care translated into objects. Lila stood in the doorway and cried again. Not because the room was luxurious, because it had been considered. Evan did not make a speech. He set her bag down, came back to stand in front of her, and touched the side of her face with 2 careful fingers, as if checking whether she was still entirely there. "I'm sorry I wasn't faster," he said. She shook her head immediately. "No." "Yes," he said. "I should have anticipated that if your family found out before I spoke to my father, they might panic." "You couldn't have known they'd do this." "I should have known panic makes people cruel." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "Stay." So he did. He stayed while she showered and changed, and sat cross-legged on the bed eating toast she did not remember asking for. He stayed while Nora coordinated quiet logistics in the hallway. He stayed while the doctor assigned to her case called to check on stress symptoms and blood pressure. He stayed until she fell asleep with one hand curled over her stomach and the other still holding on to 2 of his fingers, as if some part of her body required proof that this version of the day was real. 3 days later, her mother called first. Elaine was crying too hard to arrange language properly. The apology came in fragments. "I'm sorry. I was scared. I don't know what I thought. I kept hearing people talking already, and I let it get inside me. I should have called you back in. I should have stopped it. I should have gone after you." Lila listened. Then she said, "I need more time." Elaine cried harder but said she understood. An hour later, Thomas called. His apology was different. He had spent 3 days with himself, which for some men is the harshest punishment available. He did not cry. He did not dramatize his remorse. He spoke with the deliberate precision of someone refusing himself the comfort of vagueness. "I was wrong," he said. Then, after a pause, "And I need you to understand that I was wrong before I knew who he was." Lila sat by the window while he spoke, the garden outside washed silver by late afternoon light. He said the important thing was not the SUV, not the title, not the neighbors, not the embarrassment of discovering that the man on his porch outranked every assumption he had been hiding behind. He said the important thing was that he had put his daughter out of her home when she was frightened and pregnant and asking for 1 day of trust. He said he had known, even while doing it, that there was something mean in the speed of the decision. He said he had done it anyway. He said he had no excuse worth insulting her with. Lila did not forgive him then. That was not the moment for it. But something shifted. Truth, spoken without self-protection, can move a locked thing half an inch. The next week
President Adrian Carlisle met her in a private family sitting room. He stood when she entered. He crossed the room himself rather than waiting for her to come to him. He took both her hands in his and said, "I'm very glad to finally meet you." Not polished, not performative. Warm, specific, human. Lila had seen his public face 1,000 times on screens and podiums and debates. This was not that face. This was the face of a father receiving the woman his son loved and the mother of his grandchild. He asked no intrusive questions, made no show of magnanimity. He welcomed her in the oldest, simplest way, with attention. The conversation lasted nearly 2 hours. They spoke about practical matters first: medical care, privacy, security, the press strategy if or when the relationship became public, whether she wanted her own place later or preferred to stay near family support through the birth. He asked her opinion as if it mattered, which should not have felt remarkable, and yet after the week she had had, it did. Then they spoke about less practical things.
Her work, her childhood, what she read, what frightened her most about becoming a mother, what she hoped her child would inherit from Evan, and what she hoped he would be spared. Adrian Carlisle listened with the full concentration of a man who had spent years learning that listening carefully is one of the rarest forms of respect. At one point he smiled and said, "My son has always been hard to impress in the right ways. I'm relieved his judgment remains sound." Lila laughed unexpectedly, and some final stiffness left the room. At the end of the meeting, he said, "I'm glad he found you." She said, "I'm glad I volunteered that night." He nodded. "So am I." If the story had ended there, it would already have been enough for most people. Public humiliation, reversal, apology, welcome. But real life resists clean endings. It prefers aftermath, repair, complication extended over time. Ryan called 2 days later and asked if he could come see her. She almost said no. Then she heard something in his voice she had never heard before. Not confidence, not defensiveness. Something smaller and more honest. A man arriving at shame without yet knowing what to do with it. So she said yes. He came alone, carrying nothing, which she appreciated more than flowers. Gifts can sometimes be another way of asking not to discuss the actual wound. Ryan looked around the sitting room when he arrived, at the polished furniture and quiet staff and security he was trying not to stare at, and seemed to understand immediately that none of it was the point. They sat across from each other for a while before he spoke. "I should have said something." Lila waited. He swallowed. "That morning, in the kitchen, on the porch, any time, I should have said something." "Yes," she said. He nodded as if he had expected no mercy and would accept that. "I kept thinking if I stayed out of it, maybe I wasn't making it worse. And then you walked out, and I realized staying out of it was exactly how I helped." That was the first truly adult sentence she had ever heard him say. He told her he had spent most of his life learning that keeping peace in the house meant not crossing their father when emotions were high. That silence had always been rewarded as maturity. That on Friday morning he fell back into the oldest role he knew before he had time to ask whether the role itself was rotten. Lila listened. Then she said, "You don't get to be the victim of your own silence." He flinched. "I know," he said. But he stayed. That mattered too. He did not ask to be let off the hook. He did not say he meant well.
He sat there and took the shape of what he had done without reaching for comfort first.
When he left, Lila did not hug him. But she did say, "Come back next week." And for them, that counted as the beginning of something. Outside the private residence, the wider world had started to move. A photo had leaked. Of the SUV on Maple Grove. Not of Lila's face clearly, but clearly enough for the rumor cycle to start. Commentators speculated. Social media manufactured timelines. Anonymous sources invented motives. Some posts painted her as a gold digger who had planned everything. Others turned her into a saint. Both versions irritated her equally. Strangers had no trouble flattening women when they needed a narrative quickly. The administration said nothing. Evan said very little publicly. Privately, he asked her what she wanted. That became the central question of those weeks. Not what would look best, not what would be easiest to manage, not what would calm the news cycle fastest. What do you want? She wanted privacy through the birth. She wanted the relationship acknowledged but not consumed. She wanted their child to enter a room before he entered a story. So that was the line they held. In the 6th week after the porch, Elaine sent a package. Inside was a baby blanket she had started sewing years earlier when Lila was in college, and several of her friends were having children. She had made them for everyone else's babies, apparently, assuming there would be time later to make one for her own grandchild. The stitching was not perfect. In 2 corners, the thread tension had gone loose, and in one spot, the pattern corrected itself halfway through, as if the maker's hands had been shaking. No note at first. Then, folded into the bottom, a single card. "I know I don't deserve to ask this yet, but I hope he gets cold someday and uses this anyway." Lila cried so hard she had to lie down. Not because she was ready to forgive her mother completely, because grief is often hidden inside the places where love remains. Weeks passed. The baby grew heavier. Her gait changed. Her sleep became a negotiation between discomfort and exhaustion. Evan rearranged his life around doctor appointments and late-night food cravings and the strange emotional weather of impending parenthood. He came home early when he could, sat through birthing classes with the expression of a man preparing for oral arguments before the Supreme Court, learned how to install a car seat with the concentrated seriousness of someone diffusing explosives, assembled the crib himself one Sunday and refused help from 3 different staff members because, as he told Nora, "If I can't build one bed for my own son, then what exactly are we doing here?" Lila watched him from the nursery doorway and loved him with an ache so steady it no longer felt like excitement. It felt like structure. One evening, as he stood over a half-built changing table with instructions upside down in one hand, he looked up and said, "I know this isn't the order you wanted." She leaned against the doorframe. "No. I know none of this is simple." "No." He set the screwdriver down. "But I would still choose you in the middle of all of it." She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, "I know." It was one of the most intimate exchanges they had ever had. Not because it was poetic, because it was true. When labor began, it was raining. A hard, warm storm that turned the windows silver and made the whole city sound farther away than it was. Lila woke at 2:14 in the morning with a pain low across her abdomen and the immediate animal certainty that this was different. Evan woke before she touched him. That was how light his sleep had become in the final weeks. She said, "I think it's time," and he was upright before the sentence ended.
The hospital floor had been secured quietly. No cameras, no public notice, no chaos. Just doctors, nurses, hallways lit at an hour when most suffering happens under fluorescent mercy. Labor lasted 16 hours. It was not beautiful. People lie about that. It was raw and exhausting and physical in ways nothing else in her life had prepared her for. At one point, she cried because she was afraid. At one point, she swore at Evan for breathing too calmly. At one point, she told a nurse with complete sincerity that if anyone ever used the phrase miracle of birth near her again, she would personally redefine miracle. The nurse laughed. That helped. Evan stayed the entire time. Every contraction, every shift, every ugly, sacred, terrifying inch of it. He did not disappear into panic or into uselessly composed male helplessness. He fetched water, counted breaths, pressed her lower back when she could not bear the pain there, let her crush his hand without once asking her to be gentle. When she vomited, he held the bowl. When she said she couldn't do it, he did not insult her with cheerfulness. He simply said, "You already are." Their son was born at 6:23 that evening. For 1 second, there was only noise. Then there was crying. Then there was a human being where, an hour earlier, there had only been pressure and fear and faith. Lila stared at him in disbelief so complete it became silence. A nurse laid him on her chest. He was red-faced and furious, and perfect in the unreasonable way newborns are perfect, not because they are beautiful in the conventional sense, but because they exist at all.
Evan cried then. Not dramatically, not with sound, just sudden, helpless tears while looking at the tiny person rearranging his entire life by breathing. "What's wrong?" Lila whispered, half laughing, half crying herself. He shook his head. "Nothing. Nothing's wrong." Then he bent and kissed her forehead and said, with his voice breaking open, "Thank you." Thomas and Elaine came to the hospital the next day. Not because they demanded access, because Lila allowed it. That distinction mattered to everyone. Elaine entered first and started crying before she reached the bed. Thomas came behind her, carrying himself with the stiff care of a man who knew one wrong move might cost him the room. Ryan followed last, quieter than ever, holding a paper cup of coffee he had forgotten to throw away. Lila held the baby and watched her family approach in the strange hush that follows major life events. No one knew yet what language this reunion deserved. Was it healing? Was it reckoning? Was it just the first honest moment after months of consequences? Maybe all of them. Elaine saw the baby and made a soft sound that seemed pulled directly from whatever place mothers keep their oldest tenderness. She stopped beside the bed and looked at Lila, asking permission with her whole face. Lila nodded. Elaine touched one fingertip to the blanket near the baby's shoulder and started crying harder. Thomas stood at the foot of the bed for a long second, not looking at the child first, but at his daughter. There was something almost unbearable in that. The refusal to let the baby become a shortcut around the wound between them. "I'm glad you let us come," he said. Lila gave a small nod. He swallowed. "I know being here doesn't fix what I did." "No," she said. "No," he agreed. "But I'm here anyway." That was the right answer. Not redemption. Presence. Ryan stepped forward last. He looked at his nephew like people sometimes look at fragile things they do not believe they are allowed to touch. "He's louder than I expected," he said. Lila laughed. It broke the room open just enough for everyone else to breathe. The baby yawned. Elaine laughed through tears. Even Thomas smiled, brief and uncertain and real. Repair did not happen in that second, but possibility did. And for many families, possibility is the first miracle they actually earn. In the months that followed, nothing became simple, but many things became truer. Thomas came by on Sundays and learned how to hold his grandson without speaking too loudly, as if volume itself might disturb the chance he had been given to love correctly this time. Elaine brought food, then stopped bringing so much once Lila told her, kindly but firmly, that care is more useful when it listens before it arrives. Ryan became the uncle who showed up to fix shelves and stayed to rock the baby at 2 a.m. when sleep refused everyone else. Evan and Lila married quietly a year later. Not as damage control, not as public proof, not because the original crisis demanded a ceremony to finish itself respectably. They married because enough time had passed for the decision to belong entirely to joy. There were no dramatic speeches at the reception, no references to the porch. No one mentioned the SUV or the neighbors, or the day a whole block learned too late how quickly dignity can be misjudged. Some stories do not need retelling once everyone in them has been changed. But if you had watched Thomas Bennett that evening, holding his grandson on one arm while watching his daughter laugh with the man she chose, you might have seen in his face the permanent trace of a lesson learned too expensively. He had almost mistaken fear for principle, almost mistaken public opinion for moral truth, almost thrown away one of the best things in his life because he wanted the outside world to remain uncomplicated. The outside world was never going to remain uncomplicated. Love never was. Family never was. Courage certainly was not. And that, in the end, was the real story. Not that a powerful man came for a woman and changed the script in one afternoon. Not that a black SUV turned onto a quiet street and made the neighbors stare. Not even that the father of her child turned out to be the president's son. Those were the visible parts, the cinematic parts, the parts strangers would repeat because they sounded like plot. The real story was what happened before that. A daughter asking for one day of trust and not receiving it. A woman carrying new life while discovering exactly how conditional old love can become under pressure. A man choosing responsibility before applause could reward it. A family learning, far too late, that shame is a terrible compass. A brother discovering silence is not neutrality. A mother understanding that panic can turn love into betrayal if left unchecked. A father realizing there is no status high enough to excuse abandoning your child. And a woman standing on a front porch at 10:17 on a Friday morning with 2 bags and nowhere certain to go, finding out that courage does not usually arrive feeling heroic. Sometimes it feels like heat and humiliation. Sometimes it feels like carrying your own bags because no one else will. Sometimes it feels like walking 3 blocks to a library while your phone dies in your hand. Sometimes it feels like saying, "I need more time," instead of pretending forgiveness is free. Sometimes it feels like labor, or apology, or beginning again. But it counts. It all counts. And if one day her son ever asked about the scar tissue running quietly beneath the history of his family, Lila knew she would not tell him the story as a fairy tale. She would not teach him that rescue is the center of love, or that power is what made people finally behave better. She would tell him something harder and more useful. She would tell him that people can fail you before they understand what they are doing. She would tell him that some apologies are real and still arrive too late. She would tell him that being loved by the right person does not erase what the wrong people did, but it can help you survive long enough to decide who gets to stay in your life afterward. She would tell him that dignity is not something other people hand you when they approve of your choices. It is something you keep carrying, even when they put your bags on the porch. And she would tell him this, too. On the worst day of her life, when the door closed behind her and the street ahead gave her nothing certain at all, she kept walking. That was the day everything changed. That was the day she found out who would stand beside her. That was the day everyone else found out too.